the Game of Thrones, where you either win or you die. There is no middle ground. This is the game that you will engage in with A Song of Ice and Fire Roleplaying by Green Ronin Publishing. Now, this is set in the world of Westeros, but what is Westeros besides the map behind me? I'll go into more detail when I talk about the campaign guide for the setting, but in broad strokes, Westeros is a low magic world. It far more resembles the tumultuous history of the British Isles of our world than it resembles a high fantasy setting like Toril or one of lower fantasy like Middle-earth. Westeros is created by George R.R. Martin in his book series, and it has recently been brought to the small screen by the HBO series A Game of Thrones. Now, Westeros is a vessel for telling human stories in a backdrop of a fantasy world. Stories of love and lust and loss. Stories of glory and battle and villainy and betrayal. Stories of family, of honor, and of duty. Westeros is a world that is far more about your character's story within this world than it is about going on quests and gaining magical treasure from monsters. So, let's talk about Westeros. And this 221-page book, the first chapter is a Westeros primer. And this is an excellent grand overview of the history, the geography, and all the noble houses with which you will compete for the throne with. Westeros is a very rich setting, and it is very important to have this history down. You need to know about the maesters, the scholars and the learned men, the healers of the land. You need to know about the religion of the seven gods, and the old religion with the old gods, the thousands of gods that are worshipped up in the north. And also of the Night's Watch, the sacred order that mans a 700-league long wall made out of solid ice, and they protect Westeros from invasion from the north by the barbarian wildlings and the mammoths that they ride and the giants that serve as their allies. All of this is covered in the first chapter, and it gives you a very good rundown in history of both the past of Westeros and what's going on at the present. This game is assumed to be taking place 1 year before the series begins, or 1 year before the first book. So, we go on to Chapter 2, and this is an overview of the game rules. And the game is not a difficult system. It uses d6s in a dice pool, but you don't roll them and look for successes. Instead, you roll them and you add them all up. And your abilities for your character range from 1 to 7. 1 is very subpar. This is the strength of a 98-year-old maester. And a stat of 7, well, this only comes once every 100,000 years or so, when the sun doth shine and the moon doth glow. It is truly the stuff of legend. Most stats will range from 1 to 5 that you will see in the world. Now, your skills and attributes are actually one and the same in this game. You have an athletic skill, and this is climbing, running, and jumping, and swimming. This is athletic pursuits. But it is also your character's strength, and it is also their damage in melee combat. At least it is for most weapons. The faster weapons like knives and fencing, that uses your agility for damage, for example. Now, there are 19 abilities in total. This might seem a little low, but within each are many specialties that you can take. For example, the persuasion skill has many specialties within it, and there are charm, seduce, bargain, and even intimidate in the persuade skill. And the fighting skill has within it long blades, axes, blunt weapons, spears, and fencing weapons, things like that. So they have all these different fighting styles within the fighting skill. Now, how does this work? What you do is, let's say the character of Tyrion Lannister is about to charm your pants off, and he will, because he has 5 in his persuasion skill, and within he has 3 ranks of the charm specialty. This means that he rolls 8 dice, 5 plus the 3, and he gets to keep 5 of them because that is the stat that he is rolling. He keeps the best 5, you total it up, and you check against the target number, whatever the difficulty set for the roll is. Now, every 5 that you beat the roll, you get a degree of success. And this helps out your action in many ways. For example, if you get 1 degree of success on your warfare roll, you have just barely won the battle, and perhaps you have taken massive losses, but you still won the day. If you get 5 successes on that same warfare roll, well, then you have set the entire enemy's fleet ablaze with a single pot of wildfire. Degrees of success also determines the damage that you do in combat, be this physical combat with sword and board, or social combat, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, chapters 3 through 5 governs character creation, and it is a bit of a point-buy system in that you get an EXP budget with which to build up your character skills. And it is actually based off of age. The older your character is, the more EXP you get. But an older character gets less destiny points. And what a destiny point is that you can either spend it or burn it permanently. And when spent, this is a temporary measure, it will give you a minor bonus to your rolls, or you can change the scene in a minor way. Perhaps you are searching about and you find a key under the mat, and you can open a door or a chest that you need to find some evidence in. Now, if you burn a destiny point, then you either get a massive bonus to your roll, or you have changed the scene in a significant way. Perhaps when your enemy has their sword to your throat, you burn a destiny point to avoid certain death, and instead you're captured and taken for ransom and sold back to your noble house, instead of having your head lopped right off. Now, at character creation, if your character is of adult age or more, you have to take some kind of flaw. And if Westeros knows anything, it's flawed characters. Now, these flaws can range from being bastard born and you cannot inherit anything and people don't trust you. Perhaps you're hideously scarred. Perhaps you have a dark secret. Perhaps you have an eye missing or your arm is off. Or maybe you just are terrible in social situations. Or you are furious all the time, and every time you engage in any sort of social situation, you have to roll Intimidate first, and it puts you, it does not put you on people's good side whenever you're engaging in an intrigue. At character creation, or later with EXP, you can also get certain advantages, merits, or feats, as they might be called in another game. Perhaps you are very attractive, or perhaps you are the heir to a house, and you are afforded such status. Perhaps you have an heirloom from your house, and you have a Valyrian steel sword, or some other amazing thing passed down through generations. Perhaps your character is massively wealthy, or they have a legion of bodyguards, or maybe they're part of the King's Guard, 7 amazing knights that guard the king himself. Or perhaps you have the advantage of being part of the Night's Watch. Although, when your character goes to the wall and joins the Night Watch, you might argue that it is not, in fact, an advantage. Now, your character, as I said before, can range anywhere from 9-year-old Bran Stark from this series, or 98-year-old Walder Frey. So, depending on the age that you choose, you get the EXP with which to build your character. If your character is of middle age or more, that is when you have to start taking physical flaws. And this creates, I think, a very interesting character around, I would say, middle age. It's kind of my favorite. It gives you enough EXP to have a goodly amount of skills from a life of experience. But you also start taking these physical flaws. And I like the idea of a badass warrior who's, he's older, he's 45, and he's got a flaw in, let's say, endurance. So he can't fight as long as he used to be able to. But he has been at war for about 20 years, and so he has a great deal of experience, and he can beat down any sort of whippersnapper that tries to challenge him. But he knows he needs to fight smarter and not harder. And so, after character creation, we go to chapter 6, and this is my favorite. This is when you create the noble house that the party is all beholden to. Now, you can either roll or choose the location. Will your house be in the frozen north? Will it be in the rich westerlands that are filled with gold? Will it be in the Iron Islands, a hard place full of reavers and pirates? Or will you be from the mysterious and arid southern lands of Dorne, where they have silk and spices? These locations affect the stats of your house. Yes, your house has stats, and these stats are defense, which is man-made or natural defensive structures like castles or valleys. There is influence. This is your political influence, your sway amongst the court. There is land, which is just the sheer size of your land and the features therein. There is law, which is how safe your land is. There is population, which is fairly self-explanatory, how many people there are. There is your power, and this is straight up, this is just military power. And then there's the wealth of your house, also fairly self-explanatory. Then you can roll or choose the age of your house, and this determines how many events that you randomly roll up on a chart. And these events can be good or ill for your house. There can be an ascent to glory, there can be conquest, but there may also be defeat, and there may be madness of one of your ancestors. There may be victories, and there may be villainies, there may be betrayals. And you roll up these events, and they affect the stats of your house accordingly. And but the best part is that you create this storied house. You create this history of your house. You roll up these events, and then you string them together in a tapestry that is the history of your ancestors. Perhaps it is a glorious one. Perhaps it is shameful and you do not speak of it. But more often, you will have things that make you proud, and there will be certain debased ancestors that you sweep under the rug and do not speak of. Now, I'm all for building a character, but I really enjoy the random aspect of the history of the house that you were born to, because you can choose your friends, you can build your character, but you can't choose your family. So, the next step is to buy the holdings of your house. And in this, you're spending those points that you've rolled up previously for your house. Let's say you have a 40 in the land stat. What does this mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything until you start buying terrain features. You start buying forests from which to hunt game. You start buying mines from which to mine gold or steel or iron. And you start buying rivers and hamlets and villages and cities, perhaps, if you have enough land. And then you use your power points and you start buying your military. Do you have a small, well-trained expert force, or do you have a mass of conscripted small folk that you just beat into submission and then send them out to the enemy? Or perhaps you use your wealth stat and buy a bunch of mercenaries who they will fight for you, but they're not to be trusted. Speaking of not trusting anyone, the next chapter is on the intrigues, and this is the social combat. And it's an interesting concept, but unfortunately I find that it sort of grinds the game to a halt in social situations, which is when you really want it to be flowing at its best. Now, the problem resides in that there is a certain social armor, as they call it, and this is gained only through not liking your opponent. Now, some people might metagame and say, I don't like anyone, so I'm not going to get influenced. Well, that's just trash playing, so don't allow that. But if two characters genuinely do hate each other, but they're still trying to influence each other, perhaps through intimidation even, then it really does just grind things to a halt, as the armor on both parties is so high, you can't really get any influence in. Now, it sort of reaches this stalemate. Now, what I feel needs to be done is you take the social armor for the different levels of dislike that you have for your opponent, cut it in half, round up, add 1, and I think that would allow influence to still happen amongst people who didn't really like each other that much. Now, what I do like about the intrigue system is that when a character is friendly to you, they have very little social armor. So this, of course, makes the strategy of approaching someone and giving them gifts and charming them and seducing them. And eventually, that's when you start influencing them. That's when you start bringing them around to your way of thinking. And I also like that there are many, many social maneuvers that you can do in this social combat. And each one has a different, for lack of a better word, a different attack roll and a different area that it uses your damage for. It engages all of the social stats and the mental stats in the social combat in some way. Perhaps you will taunt someone. Perhaps you will try and incite them into a rage and attack you at the banquet, and then they are thrown in the brig. Or perhaps you will seduce or charm or lie or cheat or steal. All is fair in love and war in the intrigues of Westeros. Now, how the social combat works on a mechanical level is that you literally duel with words. You make your social attack. Perhaps you're going to use your barbs of wit, and you're going to taunt someone. You roll your taunting skill. It's in Persuade. So you roll that, and then you check that against their social defense. And this is a product of their status and their awareness and certain composure stats. And then you try and deplete their composure, which is essentially the social hit points of this social combat. And when you have reduced someone's composure to 0, they have now come around to your way of thinking. So perhaps you have frustrated someone into a rage, and they punch you in the head, but actually you have gained the victory because they did that in the presence of the king. Or perhaps you have charmed or bargained or seduced someone, and now they're your friend for life. And a quick note on status. Status is the most important stat of the game, and it ranges, like all the stats, from 1 to 7. Now 1, you're a monkey-ass peasant, and they will not be able to win any sort of social engagement except against other monkey-ass peasants. At 7, you're either the king or the queen, and you can socially dominate anyone, as is your will. And that's appropriate, for that is their divine right. Status affects all things in Westeros. It affects all sorts of social engagements, but it also just affects your character as they walk or ride down the street. It determines who gets out of your way, it determines who bows to you, and it determines who you must bow to. It is the quest for more status, it is the quest for more influence that is the Game of Thrones. And the Game of Thrones is the beating and bloodied heart at the center of Westeros. Now, the next chapter is physical combat. This is when the metal meets the meat. And combat is simple, it is dangerous, and it is visceral, as well it should be. And the mechanics very much resemble the intrigue that we've just talked about. You make your attack, either using your fighting skill for melee, or your marksmanship skill for either throwing or using a bow or crossbow. And you attempt to beat your opponent's defense. Then you check your degrees of success, how much did you beat it by, and then you apply your damage, which is reduced by your opponent's armor that they are wearing. And this results in 2 styles of a combatant. Perhaps you're going to go for the bravo aussi water dancer fencer style. Perhaps you'll be lightly armored and have a massive defense so that you can dodge any attack, but when something does land, you're in a bad way because you're just wearing padded or perhaps leather. Or will you be the plate mail clad tank, tromping across the battlefield, blows from your opponent's weapons just glance off your glorious plate mail? Because wearing armor increases your soak, but it lowers your defense, so you are easier to hit when you're wearing plate. Now this creates an interesting conundrum because your defense is based off of the awareness, agility, and athletics stats. You add them together and that's your total defense. Now, if someone is not good at these stats, if they're not aware, if they're not agile, if they're not strong and athletic, if they're a poor combatant, then wearing heavy armor is actually a liability because it lowers their defense so much that people have an easy time slipping that dirk right into their eye slit on their helmet. But this does make sense. After all, knights train all day, every day, and you don't really want to waste plate mail on some Nimrod who's just going to go into combat and get himself knocked off his horse, and then a peasant cuts his throat. So, also in combat, you have your different fighting styles, and these are advantages either bought in character creation or purchased later with EXP. And I really like these combat styles because they make the different weapons that you use, they make them feel so different. You know, an axe, for example, is all about leaving your opponent with bloodied wounds that start draining their hit points round after round. Or it is also expert at hacking off limbs with the greatest of ease. A blunt weapon like a Morningstar or a mace is great for shattering a shield, caving in a breastplate, and destroying your opponent's armor so that you can crush them like a crab and then eat the delicious meat inside. And the sword is an interesting fighting style because you start giving up the bonus dice that you have in a specialty for more power when you do connect. So what this means is that a sword in the hands of an expert is one of the best weapons. In the hands of someone who's a midland fighter or someone who's not very good at all, the sword fighting style is actually pretty useless. And in fact, they're better off using an axe or a mace. And this is also realistic. This is also true in real fighting. The sword is an excellent weapon if you know how to use it. Now, how combat works is that you're attempting to reduce your opponent's hit points. Now, hit points are very abstract in this game. They only represent scrapes and bruises, and in fact, right after a combat, if you have a minute or so to catch your breath, your hit points immediately go back to full. So where does the nasty visceral combat come into play? Well, it comes in through a very interesting system of wounds and injuries. And this engages the defender when they've taken a blow. When they have been struck for, let's say, 6 hit points, they can decide to take an injury. And what an injury does is it reduces the hit point damage by an equal amount to your endurance stat. And you can take as many injuries as you have in the as equal to your endurance stat. And for every injury that you have, you are at -1 to your total die rolls for anything that you do. Now, an injury, this is a minor wound. This is a cut on your arm. This is a busted nose, and this is perhaps a sprained ankle when you dismount your horse. And when you can also take a wound. Now, what a wound does is when you have taken hit point damage, no matter how much it is, it could be 12, it could be 20. If you decide to take a wound, you now ignore all of that hit point damage, because when you're at 0 hit points, you are now in the defeated state, and your opponent can choose what to do with you. Perhaps they'll hack off a limb, perhaps they'll kill you outright, or if you're lucky, perhaps they'll knock you out and send you away for ransom. So the wound and injury system engages the defender with a certain amount of risk, because an injury will ameliorate this damage. Taking a wound will remove any and all hit point damage that you have taken from that blow. But this wound, this is a serious wound. This is a broken arm. This is a cracked skull. This is a knife in your ribs. If you take an amount of wounds equal to your endurance stat, you are now dead, and there's nothing that you can do. And so, and when you have a wound, for every wound that you have, you take an entire -1d to all actions that you do. And so it creates an interesting combat where the opponent is engaged, they're making the attack, and then the defender is engaged as they look at this attack and decide, ooh, do I want to risk? Do I want to risk taking an injury? Do I want to risk taking a wound? Or do I just take this directly to my hit points? But when you have hit points, you're fine. But when you're at 0 hit points, you're now completely at your opponent's mercy. And so it really plays up that visceral, dangerous risk that is melee medieval combat. And another word on injuries and wounds is that there is no magical healing in Westeros. At best, a maester, a scholar, will set your broken arm and sew up your wounds and stanch the bleeding and maybe give you some leeches to get rid of that bad blood that you'll get after infection sets in. Now, so it makes you not really want to risk combat as much as you might in other games. And as you may also see from the injury and wound mechanic, it's very difficult to kill a character in one hit if they can decide to take a wound. And this is because primary characters, which is all player characters and major NPCs, can take injuries or wounds in combat. Secondary characters, who are fairly important NPCs, can only take injuries. If you get them to the point where they have to take a wound, they die. And tertiary characters, who are just random ass bandits jumping out of the forest and demanding your money, these guys cannot take injuries nor wounds. All you need to do is deplete their hit points, and then they are in the defeated state, and you can do with them what you will. And so that is the grim and visceral combat of A Song in Ice and Fire. Now, the next chapter is on massive warfare. This is grand armies clashing together, or navies firing flaming bolts from their ballistae at each other. And the massive combat actually becomes a very complex and very simulationist and very realistic, I would say, miniatures game on the mass field. And if you want, you can plonk down a very realistic miniatures game in the middle of your RPG. For my money, that would drive me bonkers, but you can use it just fine. You can also just narrate the scene and say how the armies look when they're coming together, talk about the opponent's strategy, the players talk about theirs, they roll their warfare skill, they roll their leadership checks, and then you have the swirling melee, you have the terrible war go on in a narrative sense with a few die rolls here and there rather than doing a simulationist war game. Either way is perfectly valid in using the rules as they are written. Now, the next section is the narrator section, or the GM section, as you might call it in another game. And this is a good part. It tells you a bit more about the world. It gives you advice on EXP rewards, monetary rewards for things that you might get from a tournament. It talks about at the end of each month you make a fortunes roll for your house, and certain things affect it. And it's talking about that as perhaps your house starts sinking or starts rising as fortunes dictate. And it talks about travel, it talks about disease and infection and wounds and all that sort of thing that you'll find in a GM section in another game. It also talks about getting that feel of Westeros. The books and the show for the Game of Thrones, they're raw and they're realistic and they're just so very human, with all the glory and the gore that might entail. And I want to give you a bit of a spoiler warning in that there's one section in the narrator's guide that talks about characters in the books and the theme that each of them represents. And I made the mistake of reading this section before finishing the third book, and what I consider to be the absolute most gigantic spoiler in all the books, I read that right before reading the actual book, and so that was a problem. So, if you are new to Westeros, if you have not read the books, and if you care about spoilers, be wary of that narrator section. So, that ends the book, and I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that, unfortunately, this book seems to have been edited by Robert Baratheon himself when he was deep in his cups of wine, because unfortunately it is rife with mistakes. In the lands section, when you're creating your house, they give an example of buying your house's geographical features in an example, and then right next to it they have a chart of the land types and how many points it costs. Unfortunately, the example, the points cost in the example and the points cost on the chart are completely different. So you have to choose one or the other, I guess, and decide which one that you're going to use for your game. They also say that every 200 gold pieces will increase the wealth of your house. They say that in one section. Later, they say it's every 1,000 gold pieces will increase the wealth of your house. Which one is it? I guess you have to decide for yourself. Now, there's plenty of mistakes in the book, but none of them are so egregious that you can't suss out the meaning by yourself. It's more of an annoyance than it is a crippling factor. All in all, I think it is an excellent RPG that has a bit of growing pains. It's an excellent first draft. So, that is A Song of Ice and Fire role-playing. So, get out there and start playing the Game of Thrones.